In the name of the Holy One, blessing us, changing us, challenging us. Amen. On the front cover of your service sheet today, you will see, just under the second Sunday of Advent, the words of our Advent theme. A quote from the essayist and writer Richard Flanagan. We will discover the language of hope in the quality of our courage. It spoke to the worship team as we chose a theme for Advent of the active nature of the hope that is required of us and given to us this Easter. We also have this amazing fabric sculpture that Laurie has created, a rose-breasted cockatoo, and that evokes Emily Dickinson's words about hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. We receive our hope through our actions, but even when we can't find the words to name it, it endures. We seek it also in the sacred texts of our tradition. But the people who chose the lectionary readings for the second Sunday in Advent were not really getting into the Christmas spirit. John the Baptist takes no prisoners. There are no tinsel trees or flickering candles, no sweet carols in his words. But John the Baptist makes sense when we see him as a descendant 800 years later of Isaiah, one who was writing in the time of the exile. Isaiah's prophetic poem paints a powerful, memorable, hopeful vision of a world that is dramatically different to that which the people of Judah are experiencing. After years of rotten, unjust, tyrannical political leadership, the prophet speaks to the people of a new ruler who is to come. And this new ruler will not just transform politics, the whole people of God will be transformed. A shoot shall come out from the stump of Jesse, and a branch will blossom. The Spirit of Yahweh will rest upon you, a spirit of wisdom and understanding, a spirit of counsel and power, a spirit of knowledge and reverence for Yahweh. You will delight in following the ways of Yahweh, and you won't judge by appearances or make decisions by hearsay. You will treat poor people with fairness and uphold the rights of the land's downtrodden. We know about that image of green life that emerges fragile and yet somehow defiant from a dead tree stump. We know it in the weeds that sprout in the concrete in the midst of the city. And just now, we know it intensely in Australia, when we do see signs of regeneration that come after fire. Though God knows it is hard to hold on to hope of new life in the midst of these bushfires that are being experienced now. Yes, the dead earth will live again, but now we dwell quite appropriately in a time of grief for the earth and in a state of deep despair at what humans have done to it. In despair, we may doubt the truth of the Easter hymn, "Now the green blade rises." Love lives again, that with the dead has been. Love has come again, like wheat that springs up green. Dwelling in doubt and despair is appropriate now. And hope, courageous, ferocious hope, does not deny despair. At the Common Dreams conference, Jason John, who was here this morning, I just noticed, did a presentation which I wasn't able to get to, but which I have heard about an axis that has along the bottom deep despair and up one side ferocious hope. And it's a really helpful image. It's been picked up by the Grail for their Advent series, and Elizabeth brought it again to us in Reflect and Connect this week, because it reminds us that you can have both hope and despair. It's not a linear continuum, but you can dwell in both places, and that we decided on Thursday you might move day to day, even hour by hour, as to where you are on that axis. Deep despair, ferocious hope, both and. The prophet Isaiah understood this tension and paradox. This week's reading, though, is even more powerful when it's read in its setting. At the end of chapter 10, the prophet Isaiah says that God is going to cause the trees to be cut by an enemy military campaign. That's why there's a stump when this passage begins. It's not accidental or random. It's not just a stump sitting there. It's the result of God's judgment sweeping across the land. But judgment of the people's failure to care for the poor and to raise up the downtrodden. Walter Brueggemann cast the scene as a great struggle, a deep conflict and contest, he says, between the stump, which is Israel's current political position, and God's spirit, the power beneath the religious yearning of the people of Israel. Isaiah moves between deeply judgmental, critical accounts of the reality of what's happening in Judah, the life of the people of God and their king, what they've done wrong, where they've taken the wrong path, and intersperses this judgment, this naming, with utopian visions of what might be possible with God. For today in our readings, we don't read Isaiah 10, but we do have uncomfortable words of judgment from John the Baptist, accompanied by a call to repentance. Repentance is not just a matter of saying sorry. Repentance is doing the hard work of naming the wrongs, dwelling in the pain of that, and making a radical commitment to a radical reorientation of self and society. We are used to comparing John the Baptist to Jesus, who really seems like a much nicer guy. But the writer of Matthew's Gospel included John's harsh words for a reason. As progressive Christians, we might wince with discomfort and reject the ways that the church has used the naming of sin and judgment to shame people, to keep people dependent on priestly power, on the power to effect confession and absolution. But in rightly rejecting that construction, we might also lose the wisdom of repentance. In appropriately rejecting the idea that God might consign some people to eternal damnation, or that God might order the execution of enemies, we miss the sense of judgment as assessment, an assessment which allows us to consider how our lives, personally and collectively, measure up against what we know through the Hebrew scriptures and through Jesus, what we know to be God's will for the people and for the planet. Isaiah's hearers knew despair. The temple, which they believed would always be at the centre of their culture, was no more. Leaders were corrupt. The people were scattered, unmoored from the practice of their faith, from their homes, from their families, from all that they held dear in terms of their very identity. As we can imagine the despair of our fellow citizens who have lost their homes and livelihoods and land, even those who have lost someone they loved in the bushfires, as we can imagine those people who are making a temporary home in an evacuation centre, we can begin to imagine the deep despair of the people of Judah during the exile. Yet in the midst of that, in his context in the 8th century, Isaiah somehow understood that if you cast the vision of how things could be different, then that itself will make a difference. In our context, with inept and sometimes downright evil political leadership, and I'm not being partisan here because both of our major parties have the blood of asylum seekers on their hands, and both have played their part in promulgating fossil fuel industry and denial of climate change. But in the midst of that despair, we also need to hold a big vision of what is possible with God by entering into the theological worldview of Isaiah and of John the Baptist. And in doing so, we touch our ferocious hope and begin to reshape the present through the exercise of our own courage. Isaiah doesn't give us a prescription for what the new political arrangements will look like. The only way to see what the possibilities are is if you get a sense of what God has always intended for humanity in relation to each other and in relationship to creation. Isaiah is tackling grief and loss in real and honest ways. And so in Advent, we do not put on rose-coloured binoculars and train our sights toward Christmas. We name the aspects of our time that are despairing. Most obviously, in the midst of the flames of the bushfires and human inaction on climate change, but in so many other situations as well. We don't have leaders who are wearing the belt of righteousness. Medivac has been cruelly overturned. People still languish in physical and mental distress in PNG and Nauru. There is violence at the core of many relationships, not just the violence of wars between nations, but violence in homes and families and on the street. Christmas time is marked by an increase in intimate partner violence, particularly directed by men toward women, and child abuse. And there is just what there always is. There is sadness, and there's sickness, and there's struggle. So we name and lament the gap between God's promise and where we are now. Where we are now, the powerful are not dwelling alongside the weak in justice. The lion and the lamb are not lying down together. The child and the snake are not playing safely. In Isaiah's time, in John's time, in our time, the powerful eat the weak and inject venom into the vulnerable. John the Baptist in chapter 10 of Isaiah say, if you get it wrong in terms of connecting to the vision of God, if you fail to attend to the ways of God, there will be political chaos. In chapter 10 of Isaiah, the Master Lord of Armies hacks away at the treetops with an axe, connecting us plainly with John the Baptist. An axe will be laid at the root of the tree. And yet the shoot that emerges from the felled tree is a genuine message of hope. Hope that is not understood fully unless you have grasped the full extent of despair. We say that Advent is about waiting, but it is not waiting absent-mindedly, wondering what's going to happen. Advent is an intentional waiting in which we are invited to look within to see what is the truth about our own lives and that of the world in which we live. But it also invites us to look up, to imagine how it might be different, to imagine how we might be different. Isaiah's vision was picked up by the writer of Matthew's Gospel, communicating decades after Jesus with a Jewish audience, connecting Isaiah's vision of a peaceable reign of God with the life of Jesus. Jesus who stands up for righteousness, who stands up for the people of the land, and especially for the poor and the excluded and the outcast. If we pay attention to this week's reading, rather than rushing toward the child in a manger, we will see things emerging that the claims of Christmas start to address. What does this ruler look like? How will this one come to us? What does justice, right judgment, wisdom, insight, and strength look like? The gospel is an account of the ways in which the life and ministry of Jesus fulfill these expectations. And for us to make sense, to gather here today, for me to reflect on these readings, we must hear them in our own culture, where there continue to be questions about the viability of the settled political accommodations that we've come to about the way our lives are governed, about how we relate to one another, and what we are doing in relation to creation and the environment. In so many places around the word of hope comes to us in people who are saying that what we've settled for might not be the best way. Isaiah's vision and John's words of judgment are not fact, they're poetry, but they contain truth. They invite us to use our imagination to find another way. And for Christians, utopian imagination like that, which has a strongly political and poetic dimension, connected to Isaiah and to a particular claim about God's relationship with a particular person who will come to bring justice, restore creation, and bring the nations back to God. That is the message that we are hearing as we move toward Christmas. And this is not going to be done by God, but by a human ruler in Isaiah. This is the one upon whom the Spirit of God rests. And that connects with the Christmas story that tells us that God endowed Jesus of Nazareth with that Spirit. And when we look at his life and the way that it embodies these values, we get a sense of how we might follow in his way. The Messiah, which means the anointed one, is the one on whom God's Spirit rests. And for Christians, this is deeply centered in Jesus. In listening to Jesus, we hear the answers to our questions. What does the world need to be? Where does God show up in the midst of this? Where do we encounter God? So in Advent, we hold on to the vision of how the world might be different. And we also come to see where God might be present in the world. We're going to conclude this time of reflection listening to Steve Earle's song, Jerusalem. There are so many beautiful pieces of Christmas music, classical pieces, carols. But John the Baptist was a rough-edged person, and Steve Earle is a rough-edged singer. And I thought that after I leave here, you might not get very many more opportunities to hear Steve Earle for a while. And I might not be, it might be a while before I'm able to get away with that at St Michael's in Collins Street in Melbourne. But we are aware of a Christmas that Steve Earle addresses. Not a sweet and beautiful Christmas crib scene of a silent and holy night, but a burnt desert landscape where the military machines roll over the ground where Jesus stood. And we are aware of our calling to think about the relationship of the people of God to each other and to all the creatures and to the creation, and to hold on to our hope of beauty and peace, that the green will come again as God is incarnated in us as peacemakers, as people who bear a courageous, hopeful vision of the world not as it is, but the world as it will be. Amen.